Hello, this is Steve from SV Panoply, and I've just received another anchor for testing. This one comes from the Anchorite people down in Australia. This is an aluminum version of their Sarca Excel. It is a number 5 size, so it's the exact same external dimensions as the previous Excel that I tested, which was galvanized steel. So exactly the same anchor, but it weighs just about half as much. So the aluminum Excel came in at 27 pounds on my scale, whereas the steel version was at 50 pounds. If you recall, the steel version has a tip to total anchor weight ratio. I believe it was 20%. I'd have to go back and look at my previous video. But the aluminum anchor, being lighter in total, with a fairly heavy tip, that ratio's increased. It's about 30% on this anchor. Both anchors utilize a weighted tip. The steel version has an all steel weight, and I believe on the aluminum version they have sealed lead into the tip cavity. By the way, I'll mention that the overall build quality and the way this anchor is put together is really great. I've done a lot of aluminum fabrication. My boat is aluminum, and I've modified it heavily, so I've done quite a bit of aluminum working. And to me, this is really an interesting anchor just to look at. I really appreciate the effort into the design and the execution, and I'm also very anxious to test it. The anchor shank is a little different than the steel version. On this aluminum Excel, the shank is demountable, and you'll see it's got a fairly clever arrangement. It sort of interlocks, and the shank is inserted up through the bottom of the fluke. Kind of hard for me to do this with one hand while I'm holding the camera. But as you can see, once it's locked in place, it can't continue to be drawn out, even without the bolts that keep it in place. So it's a clever design. Again, it's different than the steel version because it was just welded in place. And because of the way this is drawn through, this shank does not have this roller stop feature that the steel version has. So that's missing, and we'll see how it fits on my bow roller. Another difference is that because aluminum doesn't have the strength of steel, they have increased the thickness of the shank to a size that will basically match the strength of the steel version. So I think this provides a very interesting opportunity for us. We've got two anchors that are virtually identical in physical dimensions, but one is half the weight, and I'm looking forward to seeing if that weight difference changes how the anchor behaves on the bottom. Okay, first test is at my standard sandy mud site. We're in 26 feet of water, and with my bow roller and 105 feet of chain, this makes for 3.5 to 1 scope. Notice that container in the foreground. That is a crab bait container, one of the few man-made objects we've seen on the bottom. So here it is. Initial set is with a 2-knot back down. Anchor sets within a couple anchor lengths, and it does hold the boat in reverse power at 3,000 RPM. Boat's now passing by at 3.5 knots in order to simulate a wind or current reversal. Anchor releases from the seabed, and notice as it's dragging along that the camera mount is partially lodged under the left side of the fluke. Not sure if that is a reason it dragged so far, but it did drag for about 100 feet. I've edited out most of that. But the anchor did set after power and boat speed was reduced. The boat did hold the boat at 3,000 RPM, but turbidity clouded the view. I did that same reversal several more times, and it was kind of hit and miss. The anchor set reliably and quickly sometimes, but other times it didn't. I wasn't sure what was going on. You can see it had quite a bit of seabed attached to it, and here I've stopped the motion. Note that amount of seabed on the tip. Again, the anchor was brand new there. It had never been used. So the wind kicked up and the waves kicked up at that site, so I switched gears and I went over to my sand and gravel site. Here we are at 3.5 to 1 scope. Here's the initial set. Anchor sets within 3, maybe 4 anchor lengths. We've got 2 knots of current and 2,500 RPM that the anchor was holding nicely. See the chain going by there as I reversed course, 180 degrees, going by at 3.5 knots. Anchor releases from the seabed, and another short drag and resets real nicely. It stopped the boat abruptly and holds the boat in reverse at 3,000 RPM. Here on retrieval, we get a glimpse of some larger rocks on the seabed. There's a red rock crab. You don't see too many of those. Most of them are Dungeness. And on retrieval, we'll note the tip, see if there's anything attached to it. It looks clean to me, just some loose seaweed around the shank. Here we are at the same site, we're at the sand and gravel area, this time 2.5 to 1 scope. Again, current is carrying the boat away, and the road is so short I didn't have time to get back on the throttle, so the initial part of this set is kind of gentle, just boat being carried by the current. It's kind of nice change of pace anyway to see the anchor dig in more slowly. And it's holding 2,500 RPM, real good. And for the reversal, see the chain wrapping the anchor around. Anchor releases, resets in several anchor lengths, and again I was able to get the boat in position for a 3,000 RPM back down. Once again we'll retrieve it and take a quick look and see if there's anything attached to the fluke, and once again it's clean, just a little bit of loose seaweed around the shank. Okay, now we're back in my sandy mud site, and this time we're going to do my so-called Deepset test. This is where I attach the rode to the back of the vessel so I can pull it in forward gear, and my previous testing with a load cell tester produced a maximum pull of 910 pounds. So we'll see what happens. This does take a bit of time for me to get the rode reattached to the stern of the vessel, so these initial sets are just the boat drifting around with wind. We're in 26 feet of water, and again with about 105 feet of rode, we're at 3.5 to 1 scope. So now we're setting it in earnest. That was 2,000 RPM. Here's 2,250 RPM, or about 430 pounds of thrust. Here's 2,500 RPM, or 530 pounds. Anchor's just very slowly inching forward, but it's diving down. Here real soon you'll see the whole thing disappear. Note that the seaweed that's in front of these frames, it's all the same. Here's 2,750 RPM, or 630 pounds. Here's 3,000 pounds, or 750 pounds of thrust. I'm holding these power settings for 10 seconds each, but I've edited out a good portion of them just to keep the video at a reasonable length. And here's the final power setting. It's max power. I can get 3,400 RPM when the boat's not moving, and it equals about 910 pounds of thrust. Anchor's completely buried, and really hasn't moved more than an anchor length or two in this whole series. On retrieval, it took a very high amount of force to break the anchor free. I actually had to use the low speed function on my manual anchor windlass. This provides much greater force, but it's real slow. But so for this last little bit of the release, I used that bit of mechanical advantage. And we'll take a look and see if we have any seabed attached to the tip. Clean as a whistle. I would have expected some more stuff attached to it, being packed in with such high force, but very clean anchor on retrieval. So now we're at the same site once again, sandy mud bottom, 3.5 to 1 scope initially, but for this test it's my so-called reducing scope test. And for this one I incrementally reduce the scope and then pull on it, reduce it some more, and continue pulling until the anchor releases. So the initial set is with 105 feet of rode, again 3.5 to 1 scope, and the initial back down is with 3,000 RPM. A little bit of turbidity here, but we can see basically what's going on. So now the rode length is being reduced to 80 feet, or 2.7 to 1 scope. And we'll start off with 2,000 RPM for 10 seconds, but I'm going to edit out the timing on all this. Here's 2,250 RPM, 2,500, and we're in reverse power here, so these pull numbers are much less than when we're in forward. That was 2,750. Here's 3,000 RPM. See the chain lifting on the right side of the screen there? So now we've reduced the scope to 70 feet, or 2.3 to 1. And I won't show you all these power settings. Here's 3,000 RPM. Note the chain's lifted nicely. Rode is now reduced to 60 feet or 2 to 1 scope, sorry. Chain's lifted nicely. Oh, look at that. There's a pipefish swimming by. We don't see too many finned sea creatures. Lots of crustaceans, but here's the Rode is reduced to 45 feet or 1.5 to 1 scope. These scopes are for test purposes only. You do not anchor with scopes anywhere near this. These are just ridiculously short. So here we are, we've reduced the scope now. We're cranking it into 40 feet or 1.3 to 1 scope. And I'll let this run, at least show you all the RPMs. That was 2,000 initially. There's 2,500. Here's 2,750. And 3,000 RPM. It's pretty amazing. This is one of the best performances of all the anchors I've tested in my whole series. Pretty remarkable that it could hold the boat. It's about 300 pounds of thrust in reverse and just a ridiculously short scope. Now one of my more standard tests. This is back at the sandy mud bottom just for a normal setting and resetting at 2.5 to 1 scope. Got 75 feet of road out, 26 feet of water. Here's the initial set, backing down about 2 knots. Drags a little ways, it sets in 10 or 15 feet and brings the boat to a halt. Boat's passing by at 3.5 knots. Anchor releases from the seabed. See the anchor oscillating there? We'll get another view of it. The anchor is jerking, and I can feel that very pronounced. It's trying to set, and I can feel the whole boat lurching as it's trying to grab. So it's real close, but it's just not quite enough to set. And I don't know if the camera apparatus pulling on the upper part of the shank is perhaps a factor here. I get into that a little later. I'll do another test without this big apparatus, so we'll see if that's a factor or not. I let it go quite a ways here, and eventually I slow the boat down. And once the boat slowed to a knot or so, the anchor set and stopped the boat. And it did that consistently. If I let the boat speed reduce, it would eventually set. So here's the second reset at 2.5 to 1 scope. And once again, the anchor drags a ways. And when boat speed is reduced to about a knot or so, it then grabs nicely. And I'm also testing, even when it stops the boat, I turn the boat around and I pull it in reverse at 3,000 RPM. So here's the retrieval. We'll see if any material is attached to the anchor, or if it was fouled in any way. I'll stop the motion here, and you can see just the tip of the anchor is really clean. There's just a little spot of it right there on the tip. So here we're going to go and retest the 3.5 to 1 scope reversal test, but this time I'm using my simple camera mount. This is the one that just looks straight down. There's no apparatus, it's just the float and the camera, so it really has no effect pulling, either with flotation or somehow jamming. So I think this is probably a more reliable picture, but just not as dramatic looking. Here it's holding 3,000 RPM, and I'm holding it for 30 seconds on all these. Boat's passing by at 3.5 knots. See the anchor rotate. And that's about textbook. It just resets immediately. And holding the boat at 3,000 RPM in reverse. Again, I don't show all of these back downs just to keep the video short. Chain's now passing by at 3.5 knots. Anchor releases. Anchor's dragging. I'm leaving in some power here. I'm not maintaining 3.5 knots, but certainly more than 2. The boat's being jerked. I can feel it. The anchor is trying to bite in, and it's got a rhythmic jerking going on. I let this go quite a ways. I'll let you watch it. By the way, and you can go back and watch, but the steel Sarca Excel that's the same size as this anchor, it never had any of these problems. So I think the bigger difference here is just the amount of weight. The amount of weight that the tip gets pushed into the seabed. And once again, the anchor does reset once I let the boat speed decrease down to about a knot or so. You see the anchor is up right there, and then I've got the boat turned around in reverse, pulling at 3,000 RPM, and it's holding nicely. You can hear the chain hit the camera on the way by there. You can see a bump. Now we can hear the chain clicking along the anchor itself. There's the third reset. Anchor releases. Drags a moderate amount. Hard to really tell exactly how far in these. Maybe 20 feet, maybe less. Held the boat nicely. Here's the fourth reset. That one stopped the boat abruptly and very quickly. Fifth reset. Once again, we got a long drag. Boat is being jerked. So it's really struggling. It's trying to reset, but it just can't do it. There's just not enough weight to bury that tip in good enough to execute a set. But eventually it does. Here I didn't reduce the speed that much, and the anchor caught and stopped the boat. On retrieval, we'll get a quick look. See a little bit of seabed on the tip, not too much. So I thought I'd continue with these investigations of resetting. This time I'm going to slow the boat down on the resets. Instead of 3.5 knots, I'm just going to pass by at 2 knots. We're back to the side view camera mount, which it's not conclusive to me whether or not that's affecting the setting. Here's the initial set with a 2-knot back down, and that was textbook. Anchor digs in nicely. Here's a 3,000 RPM back down, no more movement. Boat's passing by at 2 knots. Again, we're at 3.5 to 1 scope. Stops the boat after several anchor lengths. You can see the chain ghosting by in the background at 2 knots. Here's the second reversal. Anchor drags an unknown distance and then stops the boat. Here's the third reversal. Poor pictures, but we can hear that the anchor does set fairly quickly. Boat was brought to a halt. And here's the fourth gentle reversal. Again, we're just driving by at 2 knots. It probably simulates reality a little better than my 3.5 knot reversals, but I did pick that higher speed as a worst case scenario to really put these anchors to the test. Here's a fifth reversal. Anchor dragged about 50 feet, and again, I'm going to edit out most of that so we can keep the video a reasonable length. But the anchor did eventually reset. You can see it there. It was upright. And it's holding the boat at 3,000 RPM reverse power. Went ahead and gone some more here. Here's the sixth reversal. Anchor dragged about 10 or 15 feet and stopped the boat. And here's the seventh and final reset for this series. Got a little bit of imaging there. Once again, it sure looks like the camera mount setup might just be pulling, especially pulling kind of upward on the front of the shank. Hard to know if that's a factor. Did set and stop the boat, and here it is on the retrieval. We'll hopefully get a look, see how much material is on the anchor. Not much. The anchor consistently comes up real clean. Okay, I think it's pretty clear that the lighter weight Aluminum Excel does not have the resetting ability of the heavier steel version. Otherwise, I think the weight has no effect. Once an anchor is set, it's merely a matter of its shape that will determine how well it penetrates and buries and holds. And this anchor seems to be wonderful in its initial setting. Deep setting was great, and then that reducing scope test was did particularly well. I thought that perhaps my bigger camera setup might be negatively affecting the resetting, so I tried the smaller, lighter setup, and maybe that was a factor. But I think another factor that should be mentioned is the anchor was shipped new with a sort of a sandblasted finish, kind of a light grit feeling, and you can feel that with your fingernail. But up front here, after the anchor's been set and drugged through the substrate for these dozen or two times, this is now smooth up front. And if you recall, the very first retrieval, the anchor had a pretty good blob of seabed, but then subsequent retrievals, there was less and less seabed. In fact, I even noticed that the anchor was performing better. It was resetting more reliably in the later tests. So I think maybe as this anchor gets used more and the surface becomes even smoother, perhaps the resetting ability will improve. I hope this format that I've introduced here of having all the tests for a particular anchor put together into one video, I hope that's acceptable and watchable. It makes a little longer video, but at least it's all in one place. It was certainly a bit of a marathon for me. I was out on the water over 2 days and a total of about 10 hours. About half that time was with the engine running. I got about 5 more hours on the clock. And there was another 10 hours at my desk of editing this video and adding the narration. So it's quite a bit of work. I do not get paid for it. I have been getting some free anchors out of the deal. And I really appreciate that. These are some great anchors, and I'm learning a lot. And someday I may have a big sale and maybe get some actual money out of it. But to be truthful, if I was actually doing this for just money and no interest for my own education, I would probably need substantially more money than the value of an anchor. So with that in mind, I kind of feel like I need to start closing the door here on the anchor testing. Maybe I should retract some earlier statements that I made where I basically said I'd test any anchor any day, any time, and that was earlier in the program, and I was in a much more of a information-seeking mode. But I kind of want to wind it down. There's a few more tests that I still would like to make on some different anchors. I wouldn't mind getting my hands on a Delta and maybe a roll bar Rockna. Those are both extremely popular, and I think they could make some great comparisons to some of the metal that I've already tested. So we'll have to wait and see where things go in my anchor testing at this point. I'd still like to get up north and test some different seabeds. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that the steel version of the Excel's got this roller stop, but the aluminum version lacks it. And I'll close out with a photograph of the Aluminum Excel nestled into Panopé's bow roller. Thanks for watching, and always anchor safely. So long.